Welcome, builders, to the fourth installment of our series on programming fundamentals. Today we're going to talk about functions and variable scope. So functions are a way of grouping our code together. And if there's like a segment of code that we want to be able to reuse in our application, we'll have a function for that code. Rather than repeating ourselves over and over and over, we can write it once and then call it multiple times. And then we're going to take a look at scope. So the variables we've used up to this point have been global. So they've been at the top of our application and we could use them throughout the application. So now that we're looking at functions, we need to take a closer look at variables and their scope so we can see how long they live and then how much of the code is impacted by that variable. So to start, let's go over into the board and take a look at functions. Okay, so we're on the board, and the first thing we're going to talk about with functions is the purpose. So like I said, it's a collection of code or a chunk of code that we want to write once and then reference multiple times in our application. So the goal is to not repeat ourselves. Or there's a principle in programming called DRY, D-R-Y, don't repeat yourself. So let's write that real quick. D-R-Y, don't repeat yourself. Okay, and the way we do that is with functions. So think of a function as it's a grouping of code. It's going to have inputs and then it's going to have an output. So the inputs would be, let's say we wanted to write a function. We'll have a box here. Oops. Let's have a box. And this function will be simple. This will be an add function, okay? And the parentheses indicate that it's a function. So first we have the function name, and then with the parentheses, this is where we have our inputs. In this case, let's say it's going to take in x and y, two values that we're going to add together. So our inputs, I have my lines, we're going to take in two variables, x and y, and then we're going to have the result, which will be the return value for that function. So let's add our text here for x and y. Whoops. Those x and y values come in, and then the result, I guess we could label as z in this case, which would be the sum of those two numbers. Okay? And throughout our application, I don't have to, let's say there's special logic that we need to do around the add, where it's not just literally taking x plus y, but maybe we're logging it to a database or writing it out to the screen. There's different things we might want to do in that function, and we don't want to have to modify it in all of those places that we use it. We can write it once and then reference it multiple times. So let's take a look at what the actual function itself might look like. So first thing we're going to do is define the return type. So in this case for add, let's say we're just going to use integers. It's whole numbers we're working with, so that'll be an int. Then the function name, which is going to be add. Then we're going to have parentheses, and this is going to be our two parameters, our two inputs into our function. So the first one is going to be x, and then we'll have y. Okay? Then we need curly braces to define our block. All we need to do here is return x and y added, right? So we're going to return x plus y. And that's our function. Now, to reference this later on in our code, it would look like this, add, and I could even, let me take this a step further and say I wanted to set a variable equal to whatever that result is. So I could say I have a variable z equals add 5 plus 7. So 5 is coming through as that x integer, and then 7 is coming in as the y. And then it's going to return 5 plus 7, so the result, 12, is going to be in the variable z. So now we're going to hop over to Visual Studio and take a look at a project that was set up for this. But first, I want you to hop over to GitHub, go to github.com/buildsharper, and download Course 104. Clone that repo onto your local and open it up in Visual Studio. If you've never done that, hop over to Course 0. We cover the basics of Git and pulling down and cloning repos, or we have a whole course dedicated to Git if you want to get in more of the nitty-gritty details. So do that first, and then let's hop over to Visual Studio. Okay, so here we are in Visual Studio. I've got our Course 104 solution open, and we have two apps. So first, let's look at app 1, Program CS, and we can see let's build a calculator using functions. Okay, and it's going to take in two numbers, it looks like, and then we're going to have a menu of things I can do with those numbers, and it will output the result. So let's run it first, and then we'll analyze the code. I'm going to try things a little bit differently. Before I was looking at the code only, then running it. I think it might be helpful for you guys to see the code, or see the code run first, and then do a deeper dive into the code. So let's give it a shot. Okay, so let's build a calculator using functions. Enter the first number. Okay, let's say 6. Enter the second number. What if I typed FIVE for 5? Can I do that? That's not a number. Please try again. All right, fine. 5. Select the equation you'd like to run. Addition, 6 plus 5 equals. Subtraction, 6 minus 5. Multiplication or division. Or I can hit 5 to exit. So let's try one. Addition. Cool. 6 plus 5 equals 11. And then subtraction. 6 minus 5 equals 1. Multiplication. 6 times 5 is 30. And then division. 6 divided by 5 is 1.2. Cool. And what if I want to type Fred here? Invalid selection. Please try again. Okay. 6. Invalid selection. Please try again. All right, we're going to exit. 5. Bye-bye. And we're back in our code. So now let's take a look at what that looks like from the code side. So the first thing I'm doing is I'm capturing two numbers. I need number 1 and number 2 populated. And they're calling this function getNumber. So, and then they're passing in the parameter first and second. So let's take a look at this getNumber function and see what it's doing. So I'm right-clicking on the function name, going to go to implementation, and it'll jump down to that code. So I'm doing a while true here. Now this could potentially be an infinite loop, because while true is always true, and it will continue to loop until there's some way to break out. So let's take a look. So within this while loop, first thing we're going to do is say enter the number name number. So we typed in first, or we sent in the variable as first for this first number. So enter the first number, and then we do a console.readline to read that input. And again, here we're doing the int.tryParse, which is taking that input that they typed in, trying to turn it into an integer. If I am able to parse that input that they typed into an integer, we're going to continue. And then I'm going to return that number. And that number is then going to get stored in that first variable. Like we said, number 1 equals getNumber first. So that first number would then get stored in that variable. Now, if it can't parse whatever they type in, meaning that it wasn't a number, or it was a decimal value, something like that. If it can't be parsed, we're going to do a console.writeLine. That's not a number. Please try again. And since this is a while loop, it will continue to loop until we do this return. So finally, when they type in a valid number, we can hop out of this function. Okay? So let's go back. So we can see we do that for number 1, we get the first number, and for number 2, we pass in second, so it can say enter the second number, and it will continue to loop through with that while loop until they type in a valid selection. Like we showed in the example, when I ran it, I typed in FIVE for 5. Well, it couldn't parse that into an integer, so we got that error message. Okay? Now, I have a done variable. I like to use these quite a bit with while loops. Done is false right now, so while, and again, this exclamation point before done is the not. So while not done, well, done is false. So not done resolves to true, which means that this loop will continue to run until this variable done equals true, because not true is false, and then it will fall out of this loop. So inside of this loop, we're going to clear the screen, then we're going to display the menu. And we can see we're using our numbers that they typed in up here. We're using these down here in this loop to give them examples. So with the addition, we're showing them it would be this number plus this number equals question mark, and so on. Now we're doing a var input equals console.readLine, which is reading in their input for this menu. And again, we're doing a int.tryParse here, where we're trying to take whatever input they give, and we need it to be a number, because it's going to be based on their selection, 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5. And that's an integer. So the first thing we have to do is get their input and turn it into an integer. If we can't do that, so I'm going to collapse this, if for whatever reason this evaluates to false, we're going to fall into this else condition where we tell the user that's an invalid selection, please try again. And this will continue. Now it's going to do a read line to wait for the user to press the enter key so they can see the message. And then we'll go back up to the while loop. Now we're still not done because we haven't done anything with the done variable here. This was an invalid selection. So it's going to redisplay the menu and ask for them to make their selection. Now let's say this time they do enter a valid number. Now we're using a switch statement to act accordingly based on their selection. So if they type in 1, we said that's going to be addition. So on this console.writeLine, I'm writing number 1 plus number 2 equals, and then we're calling the function addition, passing in those two numbers. So let's take a look at this addition function. I'm going to go right click, go to implementation. And as we said, when we looked at the board, it's as simple as taking this number plus this number and returning that result. So this first type, static, we're not going to worry about right now. That gets into some more complexities that we don't need to worry about. But for the return type, it's going to return an integer. It's called addition, that's the function name. And then the two parameters are number 1 and number 2, both integers. Okay, and while we're down here, let's take a look. Subtraction, pretty much the same thing, except we're subtracting, right? Multiplication, it's the same thing except for the multiply. Division is a little bit different because we need to return a double, because if we divide, we need to know that decimal value. Otherwise, if you divide two integers, you'll get an integer back. So it would do, it wouldn't give you the point whatever value. That's why we changed our return type to be a double. And then also, you can see, as I said, if you divide two integers, you're going to get an integer back. So if I need a double, well, I have to cast one of those numbers as a double. So that's what we're doing here. I'm saying whatever this number is, cast it as a double. Cast is to convert one data type to another. And in this case, we have an integer, whatever the number is, such as 5, and we're going to cast it to a double, which would make it 5.0. Well, now, when I do that division, I get a double back, which is what our return type is. Okay, so now let's go back up. So we can see with each of these selections in the switch, we're simply writing out the numbers, and then whatever the equation equals, we put as a function call where we pass in those two numbers. Okay, and then finally for case 5, we print out bye-bye and we set done to true, which will break us out of that while loop and end the program. So that's pretty much it for functions. That's a very basic overview of a function. As I said, a lot of times these functions have a lot more functionality to them, such as, let's say we needed to create a user profile. So let's say we needed to have a user input their profile information. And then when we go to save that profile, we have to store it, let's say, in a database. Well, there could be multiple places where we want to save a user profile. Maybe there's different screens, or maybe they're signing up via email, or maybe they're signing up via web form, or there's a mobile app. There could be all these places where the data is being sourced, but we want to have one method to save everything, and we don't want to have to go change it in multiple places. So that's an example of a function that we could reuse. And that function can be as big as we need. It can take in whatever inputs we need, and then it can also return the result. Okay, so we've taken a look at functions and the concept of grouping segments of code so we don't repeat ourselves. And those functions can take in inputs that we can then use for logic or whatever needs to happen inside that function. And then we have a return value that we can send back to the portion of code that made the call of that function in the first place. Okay, but now we're going to talk about variable scope. So we've talked about variables in the past where it's a concept of, it's a way to store data, and that data is accessible inside of that variable. Well, now with functions, we have to worry about variable scope. As we work within that function, if we declare a variable, it is only going to be accessible inside of that function. For example, if I'm inside the add function and I create a new integer called XYZ, well, if I have to access XYZ outside of that function, I can't do it unless it's maybe the return type of that function. If that function returns XYZ, I can then access it other places in the application. But if it's housed within that scope of that function, that's the variable scope, and it can't be accessed outside of that. All right, so I know this is a lot to take in. So let's go to the board and take a look. Okay, so we're on the board. Let's have a square here that represents our application. Okay, so we have our application, and I've created a variable called name, which equals Chris. Now I have this function down here, say hello, and it's going to return hello, comma, name. Now, because name is a global variable, it can be accessed from within this function. So, below here, let's say on the next line, I just typed say hello. Well, that's going to just print out hello, Chris, because this variable is defined globally above that function. Now, this works since name is global. But for example, if I wanted to do name2 down here, well, this isn't going to compile because it doesn't know what name2 is. We haven't declared that variable. So, imagine if we wanted to modify their name inside of say hello. So above this return, let's say we wanted to capitalize their name and put it in a local variable. So I could say variable name2 equals name dot to upper. Okay, now name2 is scoped within the function of say hello. So name2 is valid while we're in that function because the say hello function knows what that variable is. But as soon as we exit the scope of that function, we lose the variables with it. For example, if I tried to do a, let's take a look. Below say hello, if I try to do a console.writeLine name2, this won't compile because we can see name1 exists, it's global, but name2 only existed within this say hello method. That function down here created this variable, and as soon as we return, we leave the scope of that function, and with it the variables stay within that scope, meaning that now that we're in the parent scope outside of that, we can't access that variable. Name2 is called a local variable because its scope is local to that function. And as we said, this up here, this name is global because it's globally accessible throughout the application. Now, in general, global variables are not always the best solution. What we might do instead is say that this say hello method takes in a string called name. Okay? Now, what we would do instead, we wouldn't need this first Chris variable. We could say hello and then pass Chris into it. So Chris is the value now of this name variable that is an input parameter to our say hello method. Now we can access it locally within the scope. Okay? And again, we're saying name2 is equal to the name to uppercase. And then this line, console.writeLine name2, is still not going to work because we are trying to reference a variable that is local to the say hello function. And now that we're back in app1, we're outside of that scope. So what we can do would be to say variable, let's say message equals, let's make this a little bit bigger so it's readable. Variable message equals say hello Chris. And then here we could write line the message, which would print, let's copy this out here just to show the output of this program, which would be hello Chris, right? Because the say hello method is doing two things. It's adding hello comma ahead of that string, and then it's also doing a to upper on the name itself. Now, these parameters that come into functions can come in one of two ways. They can either be by reference or by value. By default, things come in by value. So what that means is, let's go back and create our global variable. We had a variable name equals Chris. Okay, and then in say hello, we're passing in name. Now, name in this case is a global variable. It's accessible throughout the application. But we have a new variable, name, inside of the scope of this say hello method. So when it's passed by value, that means we're going to instantiate a new variable for the scope of that function. So, say hello is going to take in this string name. Well, this string name is not the same as the name up here. The variable names are the same, but the scope is different. So here, when I access name, I'm accessing this input parameter variable. I'm not affecting the global variable outside of this scope. So if I were to, let's change up our method here. We're going to still do the return, but let's say I did name equals name dot to upper, which is going to convert our name to upper and then store it back in that same name variable. And then on this line, we would write it, hello name. Again, like I said though, we're only working within the scope of this function. So after I fall out of the say hello method, I haven't affected this name variable. This is the global one, not the local one within say hello. So if I were to do a console.writeLine name here. So let's take a look at the output of this application. Well, we're declaring our name, Chris. We're creating a new variable message, and it's going to be equal to our say hello function return value. So say hello is going to take, it's going to take in a name, have a local variable name, and that name is going to be equal to the name that was passed in to upper. So if I passed in Chris with lowercase, this name is now equal to Chris uppercase. But again, this is local scope. This will not impact this name variable out here. This one's global, this one is local. So that gets stored in message with hello appended to it and then in all caps. And then we're going to do a console.writeLine name. Now this is where it gets tricky. This console.writeLine name is not going to be the uppercase version because this is the name that is scoped throughout the application, the global one. So the first name that we write line is going to be Chris. Now on this next line, we're going to write out message, which was the result of our say hello method, where we had hello, comma, Chris, all uppercase. Okay? So that's by value. The other way to do things is by reference, where instead of getting a copy of that variable that gets passed in, remember we said the name gets passed in, but this function has a local copy that it works with that doesn't impact the rest of the application. Well, when we do by reference, we send in basically an address to where that variable is stored, and it can access the variable directly. So to do that, there's one small tweak. Ahead of this string, we would type ref string name, and then when I call that method, I put ref in front of it, and that means I'm passing it by reference. So now I'm creating this variable name, Chris, and I'm passing it into our say hello function by reference, which means it's not going to make its own local copy of that variable. It's using the same variable that I declared outside of that method. So that gets passed in to say hello. I do the to upper, and then I return hello name. So let's clear this as our output. The output of this would now, let's step back through it. So we've created name, Chris. I'm having a new variable called message, which equals say hello, passing in name by reference. So now this name is the same as this name. These are the same variables. It's within say hello, it only has a reference to where the actual value is stored. So when I change this variable, name equals name.toUpper, it's going to change the one and only name variable. I no longer have one locally scoped. So when I do a console.writeLine name, it's going to write Chris in all caps. And on the next line, when I write message, it's going to do that hello, comma, Chris, all caps. So now that we've done that, let's take a look at Visual Studio and we'll go into App 2. Okay, so now I'm back in Visual Studio. I've got App 2 opened up and I'm in program.cs. And like I did last time, let's run this first and then we'll dig into the code and see what's going on. So let's run it. Okay, and I can see I have by value a bunch of ones. By reference, it's counting 1 through 10. And then I have global, it's counting 11 through 20. And then we have press any key to continue. So let's see what's going on. Okay, so I'm creating a number. Defining a number is an integer, just setting it to equal to 0. Now, here are my by value section. I have an add by value that I'm writing. I pass in the number that we could declare it up here. And then I'm repeating this from 0 to less than 10, which is 9. And again, in programming, everything's 0 based. So instead of 1 to 10, we're going 0 to 9. So we're going to repeat this 10 times, passing in by value with the number. Now, in this next section, we're going to do it by reference. And again, like we said, we're going to pass this ref before that variable. So we'll do that 10 times. And then down here, we have the global variable. So we're not passing anything in as the input parameter for this function. We're just going to reference it globally. Okay, and then finally, press any key to continue. So let's take a look at the functions. So we have this region down here. Let's expand this region. Again, this is just a way of cleaning up our code, making it easier to read. So let's expand this. Now, add by value passes in the number, and it's going to have its own local copy of that number. So there's the global variable number, which we're defining up here at the top of our application. But since this variable comes in by value, I have my own local copy that I'm working with within this add by value method. You can see I'm doing a number plus plus, which is going to increment that number. Since it's an integer, it's going to go from 0 to 1. And then finally, it's doing a console.writeLine with that number. This /t is just a tab to format it. So it's going to tab over and type the number. And it's going to repeat this, if I go back up, within this for loop. So number is 0, so I'm passing 0 into this. The add by val function gets its own copy of that variable, increments it, and then prints it. Now, since it's by value, like we said, it's getting its own copy. So every time, it's still equal to 0. And then it's incrementing it, turning it to 1. Because it's working with its local copy of that variable. It doesn't impact the global variable outside of this function. So, as we can see, for this top section, it's equal to 1 every single time because we aren't impacting the variable globally. So let's go back and look at by reference. This next section, we're specifying we want to pass in number by reference, which means I'm not going to allow this function to have its own copy of that variable. When it's manipulating a variable, it's manipulating the global variable number up here. It's actually incrementing it. So let's take a look. If I go to the implementation on this, Now, when I do a number plus plus, I'm affecting that global variable. So you can see these two functions look very similar. We're doing a number plus plus and then right-lining that number. The only difference is right here, specifying it by reference. So then, again, if I run it, I can see we did 1, 1, 1, 1, 1 with by value, because each time this function called, it got a fresh copy of that variable, which was set to 0. So 0 plus 1 is 1 every single time. Now, I'm incrementing that variable. I'm affecting the global variable. Every time I do number plus plus, it's getting higher and higher. So we can see each iteration of the loop increments that number by 1. So we get all the way up to 10. So now let's take a look at the global section. In add global, I'm doing number plus plus, but you can see I didn't take any input parameters because I can access the variable because it's global. When I do a number plus plus, now I've taken the number after it did 10 by reference calls, which took it from 0 up to 10. Now with add global, I'm at 10. If I plus plus, now I'm at 11, and so on. Okay, so we've covered functions and we've covered scope. We've talked about the importance of dry, which is don't repeat yourself. In programming, for maintainability and ease of use, it's always best to try to consolidate your code, and functions allow us to do that. Instead of having, let's say a function is 20 lines of code. Well, if you don't want that 20 lines of code copied throughout your application, because if you ever have to make a tweak to that 20 lines of code, you have to do it in multiple places, and then that's how you end up with spaghetti code, and you can end up fixing it in one place and not in the other, where if it's centralized into one function, you can fix it once and it's fixed throughout your whole application. Then we also talked about scope. So by default, a function passes in its parameters by value, has its own local copy, scope to that function only. And then if I define variables within that function, they can't be accessed outside of that function by other portions of the code. So let's move on to everybody's favorite segment, homework. So as always, the first part of the homework is to actually pull down the repo. So go to github.com/buildsharper, clone the Course 104 repo on your local, run it, and then just kind of tinker with it. See how it works, break it, make it do something different. Really understand how it's working. That's the first part of the homework. Then for the second part of the homework, I want you to write your own program. Go into Visual Studio, create a new console application. And it's going to be an application to find the area and perimeter of a rectangle. So we're going to ask the user for two values. We need an X and a Y. But then we're going to have two functions. We're going to have one function to calculate the area and then another to calculate the perimeter. Then get that checked into Git. Create a repo on GitHub, check it in, push up the code, and then tag us on Twitter @BuildSharper. We'll be sure to give you props, give you a retweet, or if you're stuck and you need help, you can reach out to us on Twitter as well, and we'll step you through it. So, that's all for now. We'll see you next time.